We are honored to be here, and even more so that the Oklahoma State University saw fit to establish this and make this a priority on this campus. I think this says so much about this school. We have, of course, a great relationship with Oklahoma State University, not the least of which is the first medical school in the history of Indian country and the history of this country, Oklahoma State University at Tahlequah. So that's great. I wasn't even going to mention that I went to OU. I was going to say I went to... Yesterday I was in Portland, Oregon, and I was giving some remarks, and they are still sore about the Seattle Supersonics becoming the Oklahoma City Thunder, and I made a little joke about it, and I was booed. And I thought that it was a little light ribbing. It was serious boos. So anyway, we have a number of people here from the Cherokee Nation. She's been mentioned, but my wife and the person that really is responsible more than anyone for me getting the office of Principal Chief, being someone who can be a servant to the Cherokee people, and that's January Hoskin, my wife, the First Lady. Mentioned her, but my daughter, the first daughter of the Cherokee Nation, she might, Mr. President, maybe she'll be a OSU cowgirl someday. I don't know. That'd be great. Jasmine Hoskin. The Cherokee National Treasurer Tommy Wildcat gave the blessing, and he is a Cherokee National Treasurer for flute playing and flute making. Good guy all around, Tommy Wildcat. The Secretary of State of the Cherokee Nation, who went to school here, graduated here, and reminds me of that all the time, Tina Glory Jordan. Also from administration, we have another OSU grad, I believe. You OSU grad, NSU grad. NSU grad, but she's an OSU fan. Oh, and her daughter, okay, is a student here. So Sonia Glory is here. Ethan Green, I know he's a graduate from Oklahoma State University. Tara Lee Montgomery from Administration Special Projects. Make sure we have not missed anybody. Jason McCarty, Government Relations and Communications. Dustin Geesland from Administration. There's no one left at the Cherokee Nation. This is all of us. We run a lean operation. I want to talk a little bit about Cherokee history today, and then I want to touch on just a few issues that confront me as the Principal Chief and confront other leaders of the Cherokee Nation and other leaders across Indian country. So first of all, let me sketch out a bit of the history. It'll be familiar to some of you. It's familiar in one respect in that it's really a familiar story that you can relate to just about every Indian nation on this continent. It's a story of dispossession, some travesties of justice, but some grit and determination and strength, and all of that leads to where we are today. We're the largest tribe in the United States, 380,000 citizens. We have Cherokee in every state in this country. I think that's remarkable. We are, I think, in an era of prosperity, the likes of which we've not seen. It's not an era that started, a month ago, 2 months ago, 6 months ago. It's been years in the making, decades in the making. But I think we're in a position of strength today that we've not seen in our long and storied history. And we've seen many chapters in which we've been very strong. They say that the Cherokee people have existed from time immemorial. We've been here since before recorded history. We were certainly here before the Europeans were lost on their way to wherever they were going and discovered a people that didn't need discovering, and we were governing ourselves just fine before they came to the continent, but they did, and that started a series of changes and challenges that helped shape the Cherokee Nation today. So before about the 1820s, if you went to Cherokee Nation, you'd be in what's now the southeastern part of the United States, and you would see a people who were very decentralized in terms of how they govern themselves. Today we elect a principal chief, a head of state, but you wouldn't have seen that during that time before about the 1820s. You would have seen very decentralized group of people that governed each other really on, not just governed each other on the town level, but almost in some ways a pure form of democracy in terms of a lot of decision making, decisions that were sometimes born out of a crisis or dealing with other Indian nations or dealing with the new neighbors, the Europeans. So that all created a situation with the Cherokee Nation, again, familiar to other Indian tribes, tremendous amount of pressure on the Cherokee Nation. Pressure from this new population growing around it, this new government forming around us as the United States was formed, war in which we had allies and allied with various sides in various conflicts, including the Revolutionary War. But that pressure came to bear, and I think the Cherokee people and the Cherokee Nation did something that's very important. I think it's remarkable, and that is that we adapted to what was happening around us. And we could have handled it in a number of ways. We could have handled it in ways that might have meant the end of the Cherokee Nation. It might have meant our people wiped out. We were warriors when we needed to be warriors, and we could have wielded weapons, and maybe we could have won this battle or that battle. Perhaps we would have lost a larger war, and perhaps we would have lost the Cherokee people. But that didn't happen. So we wielded something else. We wielded our intellect. We wielded our ability to engage in diplomacy with our neighbors, and we wielded our good sense to find friends and find allies where we could find them. And we did. And that's, I think, an important lesson that stays with us today. So as the United States is growing around the Cherokee Nation, as states like Georgia were becoming more desirous of our natural resources, our land, everything else, we changed how we governed ourselves. I said we were decentralized. We became centralized. We developed a written constitution. We elected a chief. We created a great democracy on this continent, one that still stands today. We did it, again, with a written constitution. We had the rule of law, which we adopted as our own. So we had to be able to write our own language. And it was someone who is just considered, and certainly was, a genius, and that is Sequoyah. Sequoyah gave us something more powerful than any sword or shield we could ever wield, and that is the ability to communicate with ourselves in writing, and to do so in a way that allowed us to express ourselves in written law. So we centralized and strengthened our government so we could deal with what was happening around us. It was our way, in a sense, of resisting the changes that were afoot. So that in and of itself is a long and important history. But if you fast forward a bit to about the 1830s, the pressure on Indian nations in this country, particularly in the southeastern part of the United States, was growing and growing and growing. Now, one of the points of pressure that happened in terms of our natural resources was gold discovered in the hills of Georgia. Now, most people, if you find gold in your backyard, you would say, oh, eureka. But if you're an Indian, and it's the 19th century, and you're surrounded by white people, you don't say, oh, eureka, you say, oh, something else. Because you know what's happening next. Well, that wasn't the only point of pressure, but that was, I think, an illustration of what we were dealing with. The state of Georgia believed that its laws should apply to the Cherokee Nation and on the Cherokee people and on non-Indians within our midst. We, as a people that had been here from time immemorial, that was here before anyone even uttered the word Georgia, believed differently. And we took our case to the Supreme Court of the United States. In two of the most important Supreme Court cases in all of Indian country, it's a case that still informs our understanding of the relationship between the United States and Indian nations today. Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, Worcester versus Georgia. Those cases together, in terms of its conclusion, said essentially this, that Indian nations in this country are sovereign, and we have the ability to govern ourselves, and this is significant, this is an attribute of sovereignty. We have the ability to exclude the laws of other sovereigns, but we're a special kind of sovereign. The Supreme Court used the phrase domestic dependent sovereign. And so the Congress of the United States would have what we now understand today to be plenary authority over the relationship between the United States and the Indian nations. And that's a pretty powerful concept. It means they can do a great deal in terms of how our government operates. But it also meant that the state of Georgia at that time, and today, and it's significant today whether state law applies to Indian country, that the state of Georgia's laws were excluded. Well, that did not go over too well with the governor of Georgia. Didn't go over too well with a lot of white settlers who, again, wanted to claim our lands. It didn't go over very well with a lot of members of Congress. It didn't go over well with a guy named Andrew Jackson, President of the United States. And this is attributed to him that he said, Justice Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, has made his decision, but let's see him enforce it. Now, let's see him put into action this idea that the Cherokee Nation is a sovereign. So we continue to resist, though, and I think that builds something up in our national character that still remains with us today. This idea that we are a people united, that we ought to be able to govern ourselves, that it is something endowed by the Creator that we ought to be able to self-identify and govern ourselves and manage our affairs. So we dug in. We dug in again. We didn't take up arms against the United States or Georgia, but we did take up our ability to engage in diplomacy, engage with the United States and say this is wrong. And so for a few years it was a back and forth whether the Cherokee Nation would be removed. The Indian Removal Act was passed and said the Indian nations in the southeastern part of the United States would be removed to what's now the state of Oklahoma, portions of the state of Oklahoma. We said we're not going to do it. We held out. Now, how did we resist for so long? I told you that, in my opinion, that resistance built something in our national character. I believe that to my core. I believe that we did that, taught us something that's been handed down for generations. But how did we last so long? How did we hold out so long? I told you Sequoia gave us the ability to communicate with each other. But we started a newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix, the first newspaper in Indian country, and it still exists today. We used that paper not only to talk to each other about what was going on in Washington, D.C., we used it, because it was in English and Cherokee, to talk to the rest of the world. And we built up some allies through that process. The Cherokee Phoenix went all over the country and to other parts of the world so we could tell the Cherokee story, the injustice that was happening with the state of Georgia and other states asserting their laws on our people and our lands. And the President of the United States saying that we should be removed when we'd been here before there was a United States, let alone a president. So we resisted for some time. Again, I think that built up something in our character. Ultimately, though, and there's a long history to this part between the Indian Removal Act and what ultimately happened. Ultimately, the government of the United States imposed a treaty on the Cherokee Nation. It was not our first treaty, but I think it's the most infamous treaty, the Treaty of New Echota. The Treaty of New Echota is infamous because it was not signed by the chief of the Cherokee Nation at that time, John Ross. It was signed, it was executed by a minority faction of Cherokees. The government of the United States said the Cherokee government, this great democracy that was created right here on this continent, should be ignored, and this minority faction should be the ones we deal with. Can you imagine that today? If the United States was dealing with another country and they didn't like the position that the country was taking on a particular treaty or particular international agreement, and they said, forget it, we'll deal with the minority of your parliament or this group of people who agree with us. It would be so contrary to international norms that even with what's going on today, I think the world would frown on it and the United States would back off. But they didn't. So we were removed in what's now known as the Trail of Tears. So this great society that had built up, this society with a written constitution, adherence to the rule of law, a commitment to a great democracy, an economy full of people that engaged in farming and trade, was suddenly removed. I say suddenly, there was great resistance even after the treaty. But we were rounded up in stockades, marched across the country. That would be terrible if it happened to anyone, any group of people. But it happened to the Cherokee Nation at one of the peaks of our civilization, if you will. If you want to measure civilization by the way people in the 19th century in charge of the United States measured civilization, you'd have to say, by that standard, we were meeting it. And yet, we were reduced to a people rounded up in stockades. The men and the women who built that great society, the grandmas, the grandpas, the grandbabies, all rounded up. And we lost a quarter of our population. Marched across the country. And that happened in this country, and we have to remember it. We ought to remind people of it, not just to scold this country, but to remember and to remind people what the Indian nations have gone through, and probably for lessons today. It was not a good idea in the 1830s to round up people and put them in cages. It was a bad idea. It's a bad idea today. So we were removed to what's now northeast Oklahoma. And if you knew just what I told you, which is people were rounded up, their government torn apart, we were torn apart politically, our economy destroyed, again, losing all of those people, losing maybe in a sense a good chunk of a new generation coming up, you would predict that it would take decades or generations for that group of people to come back if they ever did. And I promise you there were people in the country and around the world who counted out the Cherokee Nation. But what happened next is, I think, one of the most remarkable stories in the history, not just of the Cherokee Nation, but in the history of this country, and I think even in the history of the world, which is we rebuilt within about a decade in a very real way. How did we do it? We did it the same way we're trying to do it today. We took all of the resources that we could bring to bear, all of the resources we may have got through that treaty, and we invested them in our future. We invested in a system of law and justice in the Cherokee Nation. We rebuilt that, even though the system of law and justice in this country let us down. We reinvested in a system of democracy, even though you could say democracy in this country let us down. We invested in education, the first institution of higher learning for any woman of any race in this country was the female seminary. We now know that today as Northeastern State University. So we invested in the future. We invested in a baseline of commerce. We invested in communities. I think the Cherokee Nation did something that, had it not been interrupted by subsequent events, would have led us to heights that are unimaginable. So we did that even after all that tragedy. We really took a measure of triumph out of that tragedy. So what happened next, and I'm going to skim over a lot of great history, but at our peak, suddenly the United States Civil War, something else that split us apart. Split us apart in part because the government of the United States wasn't keeping its word. And so we were split between the Confederacy and the Union. We actually lost more people in the Civil War than we did during removal. And so once again, the Cherokee Nation reaching a height, back down again. Just when we were starting to pick up after the Civil War, those same pressures that had removed us from the southeastern part of the United States, that desire for our resources, that desire to spread the country into territory that was promised to Indian people, was brought to bear again. The state of Oklahoma created, our lands allotted, our government not completely destroyed, but reduced to something of an appointed chief, no elected council, no functioning courts. Can you imagine a great democracy in this country, a country committed to democracy, but one of the great democracies in the country suppressed to the point where it could not operate? So most of the 20th century, I'm in the 20th century now, most of the time my grandfather was alive. He was the proudest Cherokee as you'd ever know. Most of the time he couldn't vote for a chief or a council member. He wouldn't have dreamed that his grandson, would be chief of the Cherokee Nation, because most of his life he wouldn't have imagined there could be an elected chief of the Cherokee Nation. But in the 1970s, a change in federal law allowed us to reconstitute, rebuild, and that is the era that we're in now. Since the 1970s, we have been on a steady trajectory of progress and prosperity. And here, I think, is the lesson of all of that I take. When the Cherokee people are allowed to exercise those rights that the Creator guaranteed, the right to self-identify, the right to govern yourself, when we're allowed to govern ourselves and chart our own destiny, we do amazing things. We reach amazing heights. And when the opposite is true, we suffer, we don't reach those heights. But I think something else is true as well. I think our friends and neighbors ultimately suffer when the Cherokee Nation is not reaching its peak and its potential and not allowed to self-govern. And just look what's happening in the state of Oklahoma today or in the last 15 years. Great partnerships, great investments that have benefited just about everyone. In fact, I think they benefited everyone. So that's one lesson that I draw. The other lesson is this. All of those times that I think we have been successful have been times in which we didn't just have grit and determination, didn't just overcome losing a quarter of our population, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. We had the good sense to find friends and neighbors who were non-Indian to help us, because everybody needs allies in this world. We haven't lived in isolation probably ever. But we certainly didn't live in isolation during those times I talked about. We had good relationships with missionaries. There's a terrible history in world history about missionaries and native peoples. We had a good relationships with the missionaries we engaged with. We said, we don't know about your religion, but we'll take your education. We'll take your teachers. Sequoyah was a genius. He invented the language, but we didn't have anybody that could create a printing press. So we found friends in Boston, Massachusetts that could create a printing press so we could print the Cherokee Phoenix. All of those newspapers that went all over the country and all over the world, they had readers that were non-Indian that we needed to ally with, and we needed their help, and they helped us resist. So that's the other lesson that I get. And I think those two lessons stick with me today as the leader of the Cherokee Nation. Also investing in the future. And that's something every leader in this country ought to look at and focus on. So that's the brief history. I want to focus on a few issues that we're confronting today. You may not know this, but we've got a disagreement with the governor of the state of Oklahoma. It has to do with the gaming compact. Now, I told you we've been on a trajectory of progress and prosperity since the 1970s, since this new era where we're allowed to govern ourselves, manage our own affairs. One of the ways we do that is on Indian land, we can do things that, just like we said we should do with the state of Georgia, we can exclude the state of Oklahoma. But under federal law, I told you that Congress has plenary authority. I told you about that case in the 1830s that said Congress has plenary authority over tribes, but they're domestic sovereigns. So Congress passed a law in, I think, the 80s or early 90s, the National Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which said that tribes, if they want to engage in what we just might call for shorthand Las Vegas-style gaming, the high-end slot machines, the card games, ball and dice, they have to have an agreement with the state of Oklahoma. And we reached that agreement 15 years ago, all the tribes. I think that agreement, which is the gaming compact, is the most successful state and tribal partnership in the history of the United States, period. It's the most successful. And you can measure it lots of different ways. Here's one way to measure it. In the last 15 years, the tribes have sent from the state's cut of the Class 3 gaming revenue $1.5 billion. Now, that's a big number, but let me put that into some context. 15 years ago, everyone predicted it would be much less than that. In fact, it's overperformed 3 times as much as they predicted. Now look at the state lottery. It's actually underperformed, but Indian gaming has overperformed. So 15 years ago, we reached a grand bargain with the state that did 2 things. One, it resolved the issue of Class 3 gaming, allowed us to engage in gaming that would create more jobs, more opportunity for our people, which we ought to be able to do. And it also saved the horse racing industry. That was the other part of that that gets lost. 15 years ago, the horse racing industry was not in good shape. And one way to save it was to put electronic games in the horse race tracks. So that happened. So that bargain, that grand bargain between the state and the tribes has been amazingly successful, in my opinion. And I think the numbers bear that out. So here's the current dispute, if you haven't followed it. It's one man's opinion. We're right and the governor's wrong. But he would tell you different. And I respect the fact that the governor of the state of Oklahoma has an awesome responsibility to govern this state. He just does. And I have a responsibility too, to the Cherokee people. So he says that the compact expired at the end of this year. Now, I don't have the same charts that he had. I should have brought the same charts that he had. can't let him out-chart me. But if I had it here, you'd see the language of the compact that talks about renewal. The governor usually stops after it says the compact shall expire end of 2019 or in 15 years. There's a comma there. He usually reads it as a period. And I was no English major, but you know, a period is not a comma, or comma is not a period. So if you read the rest of that, it says why it would renew. And this is important. It says it renews if the government of the state of Oklahoma takes certain action, and one of those actions has to do with the horse racing industry. Normally the horse racing industry and Indian casinos you wouldn't think had much to do with each other, but they do under this compact. Because remember what we were trying to do 15 years ago. Resolve the issue of Class III gaming, save the horse racing industry. So the idea is that the horse racing industry continued with the addition of those electronic games. Of course you would want this entire bargain to continue. Now the governor says there's no such thing, he calls it a contract that renews into perpetuity. It's a compact, it's an intergovernmental compact. And I could point to a lot of examples of intergovernmental compacts, even between
states that have automatic renewal clauses. That's not unique. But this compact doesn't renew into perpetuity. It renews if certain conditions are met. That's not unusual in even a contract, let alone an intergovernmental compact. So it makes sense to me that it renews. It makes sense by the plain language of the compact that it renews. And that's really the sticking point right now. So as chief of the Cherokee Nation, I was not willing to bargain with the governor, until he actually made a proposal. I mean, the first word I heard from it was reading an op-ed in Tulsa World about the tribes weren't paying enough. I think the tribes have earned the respect to not read about maybe a proposal in the Tulsa World. I think we ought to be treated with more respect. But I wouldn't sit down and talk about the core of the compact, which is the rate that the state gets. If there was a clock ticking over my head, every click of that, every tick-tock of that clock was closer to the entire compact going away. Imagine the pressure that an Indian leader would be under to sign something, because at the stroke of midnight, December 31st, 2019, it's all going away. If that were true, then I would be at the state capitol of the governor's mansion right away to talk about it for my people. But it's not true. And because it's not true, the Indian leaders of the state were not going to sit down under those circumstances. We've always been willing to talk about the rate. But as chief of the Cherokee Nation, I can tell you this. The Cherokee people are not going to get less because of compact negotiations. What I want to do is look at the compact revenue as a pie and not change the size of the slice so much, make the pie bigger. Maybe we could do that through different enhancements to the compact. But we can't have that discussion as long as there's a phony deadline hanging over our heads. So we're in court right now to resolve that. None of the legal teams here, they would tell me, stop talking. And they're probably watching on Facebook Live. But I do think it's important to explain our position. And I respect the governor has his opinion on it. I just disagree with it. So that's one issue. Be glad to answer any questions about that. A couple of other issues. I told you that the Treaty of New Echota was an infamous treaty in that it was imposed on the Cherokee people. Now, I mentioned John Ross. After that treaty is imposed, he's chief of the Cherokee Nation. He goes to Washington, D.C., and he meets with federal leaders, and he says, that treaty's wrong. It's not a legitimate treaty. It was not signed by the government of the Cherokee Nation. And when he realized that was not going to get him anywhere, he's tried to negotiate and mitigate the damage of that treaty. And I can imagine this happening. Federal officials looking across the table at Chief Ross saying, Chief, the Treaty of New Echota is the law of the land. Well, the Treaty of New Echota says something else. It says that the Cherokee Nation is entitled to a delegate to the United States House of Representatives. It's been on the books for 180 years. We've never asserted our right to that representative. It's actually in our Constitution, which was framed in 1999, went into effect, I think, 2003. So it's the law of the land. So here is what I did as chief. I appointed the first delegate to the United States House of Representatives. Now, it gets better than that, because in Cherokee Nation, and Mr. President, I don't know if this is true on campus. It probably is. If you really want to get something done, if you need to bring wisdom, if you need to bring hard work, then you ask, in Cherokee Nation, Mr. President, you ask a Cherokee woman for help, and then you get out of the way, and you help her if she needs it. So that's what I did. I appointed a Cherokee woman, Kim T, to be the first delegate to the United States House of Representatives. And I think it was a measure of justice. I think we'll be successful ultimately. But I think it was a measure of justice for me to go to Washington, D.C. with other Cherokee leaders and look across the table to those federal leaders in the same city where they told John Ross, the Treaty of New Echota is the law of the land chief and you will abide by it, to essentially tell them the Treaty of New Echota is the law of the land and you will abide by it. There is some humor in it, but there is some justice in it. And that's part of what we're trying to achieve, is to hold the United States accountable. Make sure that this is a country that lives up to its word, because I am a proud Cherokee, and I hope you get that from how I speak about our people and our history, but I'm also a proud American. And I think this country's at its best when it keeps its word. And it ought to keep its word to the Indian nations, and it ought to keep its word to the Cherokee Nation. So that's what we're trying to do. Third issue that comes up in the news sometimes, the Indian Child Welfare Act, an often misunderstood law that is subject to a court case in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. My wife, the First Lady, as part of her platform, is making sure that people know more about the Indian Child Welfare Act and that we have more adopted families. Here's the issue. Before 1978, Indian children in this country were adopted away from their families and their tribal lands to the tune of about 25 to 35% of Indian kids adopted away forcibly in many cases. Non-Indian caseworkers coming on tribal lands not understanding the lifeways that they were seeing and saying those kids need to go, or an adoption industry that was all too eager to adopt away Indian children and save them by adopting them into non-Indian homes. Now, here's what I think. Anyone who wants to adopt a child is doing a tremendous service to their fellow man. And it's just something that's born of love and compassion, and I appreciate that. But that federal law was put into place to stem the tide of Indian nations losing a generation of young people. And it's a righteous law. It's the right thing to do. The law says that tribes as sovereigns get notice if an Indian child is going to be removed, subject to removal, and that there's a preference. The first preference, keep them within their tribe, their family, extended family, or at least keep them within the tribe is the next preference. Third preference, keep them within some Indian tribe. Often we're close geographically in terms of proximity, and there's some overlap in cultural experiences. And thirdly, make sure they get a home no matter where it is. That law is under attack because one view of it, not my view, is that it's racially discriminatory. My view and the view of all of Indian country is that it is a protection of the rights of the sovereign nation and their citizens. That ought to mean something. It means something in the world. It means something in the United States. It means something to Cherokee Nation. That's why we fight to protect it. Often you hear, I think, disinformation. Folks, I hope I haven't overstepped my time frame. Mr. President, it's been an honor. If there's any questions, I'd stand for them. But I think that Cherokee Nation is in a position of strength right now. And I just want people to remember the reason we are is because we're allowed to govern ourselves. When the Cherokee people are allowed that, we do tremendous things. I just have the good fortune to lead them for 4 years. Thank you all very much.